Good morning. I'm Jim Marshall, the President of the United States Institute of Peace, and I want to welcome all of our guests here. I see some of our employees, but most of you are unfamiliar faces to me. So let me briefly tell you what the United States Institute of Peace does. Essentially, we stop fights. We do that globally. All of you are familiar with stopping fights. You've probably done it yourselves. Well, the techniques that we have to use globally are very different than trying to keep friends from getting into a fight in a fraternity or sorority house. And what we do is terribly important to the country and to the United States' success in furthering its strategic interests globally. Our batting average is a good bit less than 500. It's just in the nature of what we do. But when we get a hit, it's a big deal. Now, having mentioned batting averages, I have to first say that Adam and I have been teammates for years. Not only were we members of Congress together, both Democrats, both on the Armed Services Committee, but we are also on the Democratic baseball team. And I will say that Adam batted 1,000 in this year's game. He went 2 for 2 and 1 walk, so he was on base all 3 times. Played center field, no errors. Of course, that's because we've got a great pitcher right now, and they couldn't get it out of the infield. And so, maybe one, but had it been hit to Adam, he'd have caught it and he'd have thrown out whoever needed to be thrown out. He's a really good baseball player, and he's a great member of Congress. I've known him for a number of years. I describe Congress often as being kind of like a high school. There are different abilities, lots of different interests, lots of different folks. It's very much like Lake Wobegon's high school. Everybody's above average. But Adam is a fellow who's extraordinarily thoughtful. And among other things, he takes notes. So you see he's got a tablet with him. I don't expect him to be taking notes during today's event. But he takes notes all the time. He's writing what's going on with the intention that ultimately he'll probably write a book. And I'm going to read that book, because this is a thoughtful guy who's had really quite an interesting perch as a member of Congress. And then he's been taking notes. So he will have an awful lot of interesting things to say about his experiences in Congress. And I'm just hopeful he doesn't cover some of the really stupid things that I did or said while I was a member of Congress. And with that, I want to introduce Congressman Adam Smith, who's the ranking member on the Armed Services Committee and a good friend to me and a good friend to the Institute. Adam.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be here at the United States Institute of Peace. The mission that Jim and all of you do here is incredibly important. I got the opportunity to meet with Jim and one of his colleagues yesterday and hear more about that work. It is incredibly important, and I appreciate that work, and I'm honored to have the opportunity to come and speak to you today and take your questions and learn more about the subject that I'm focused on, which is how development, diplomacy, and defense need to work together in U.S. policy to create greater stability throughout the world. And yes, I do appreciate having played baseball with Jim all those years, and for my first 12 years there, we always lost because, well, the Republicans were better. But then Cedric Richmond, who honestly I didn't even know, got elected in Louisiana, and he's young and he can throw over 80 miles an hour, which doesn't happen very often in baseball. So now we win. 22-0 this time, as a matter of fact. So, so appreciate it. So, actually, I came at this issue from a variety of different angles. Number one, I've been on the Armed Services Committee for 17 years, and then I chaired the Terrorism Subcommittee, which had jurisdiction over a Special Operations Command. So I got to travel around the world to a variety of different conflict zones, obviously Iraq and Afghanistan, but many places in Africa and the Philippines and others, to sort of see what our Department of Defense was doing to try to keep the peace, to try to move forward with stability. At the same time, in the state of Washington, we have an incredible presence of development agencies, the Gates Foundation being the most obvious, but PATH and a variety of others are out there as well. And they sort of pulled me in, and I started doing some traveling to see what was going on in development in places like Latin America and Africa as well. And what really struck me was the intersection of the two. And the more time I spent with our special operations guys, the more they told me we need to fund development. we need to fund that to get stability. That it is far, far easier to build a society that has opportunity so that you don't get to conflict than it is to have to bring in 100,000 U.S. troops to try to restore stability. That the two go hand in hand and have to work together. And I think we've really learned that lesson. You heard Secretary Gates in the years before he left talking about how important the State Department was, and that it's not enough to fund the Department of Defense if you underfund the State Department. They've got to work together closely in order to achieve stability. I believe the lessons have been learned. Now we just need to implement the policies that reflect that, because there are still many challenges to fully funding and fully supporting the development and diplomacy arms of this. I mean, you can look at the budgets right off the bat. The Department of Defense's budget is enormous compared to what we spend on diplomacy and development. And we could certainly use a shift in that so that we can help those elements. And then there's also there's a trust issue as well. The relationships are improving, but there is still a general feeling, I think, amongst many in the Department of Defense that on the diplomacy and development side, they don't understand why security is important. And then particularly on the development side, they feel like, well, the military shows up and undermines our mission. Now, we're doing a lot better. One of the most encouraging things that I've seen is Raj Shah at USAID. Brilliant guy doing a fabulous job. He understands this. He is meeting regularly with Admiral McRaven, who heads the Special Operations Command, to figure out how they can work together to actually use the best of all three elements of our foreign policy: defense, diplomacy, and development, in order to build and go forward. And I think the easiest way to think about it is, you look at Iraq, and you look at the amount of money that we spent, and the amount of troops, and the amount of lives we lost going in there in what was particularly initially a military-dominated operation. We were not prepared for what came after the fall of Saddam Hussein. The Defense Department, to some extent, tried to take over in an area where they didn't really have the expertise, but we had underfunded the State Department where that expertise is supposed to reside, so that it was very, very difficult. That was enormously costly. And actually, one of the most interesting trips that I took while I was on the Armed Services Committee was a trip to the Philippines, where we had not problems as large as Iraq and Afghanistan, to be sure, but they had various terrorist groups and various insurgencies there. And what we did there was a combined effort, and we're still there. Special Operations Command is there, but so is USAID. And our troops there have not fired a shot or been involved in direct conflict. What they've done is they've trained the local security forces in how to provide adequate security, and they've worked with USAID and other development agencies to build schools and drill wells and create the atmosphere where people don't want to be part of an insurgency. I think one of the greatest misunderstandings or misstatements that I've heard in a long time is it's become somewhat popular to say that poverty has nothing to do with instability and terrorism. And people make that argument because they look at people like Osama bin Laden and others and say, these people are middle class or way above middle class. It's the intellectuals who tend to start terrorist movements. And I think that's unquestionably true. Incredibly, throughout the world, we have seemingly an endless supply of people who are convinced that they have developed the one true philosophy that will save us all, and they feel it is their obligation to jam it down our throats. Those philosophies will always come up. But the question is, do they find people who will follow them? Are they just some crackpot on the corner spouting off ideas, or do they build a movement that really begins to cause damage? And that happens when you have people who don't have a feeling of opportunity, of freedom. When you look across the world where Al-Qaeda is recruiting, you look at a world of dysfunctional government, of a lack of opportunity, of a lack of jobs, of a lack of freedom. We have to put in place those broader building blocks of a just society in order to stop terrorism. Now, I have no illusions here. Even if we do that, there will still be challenges. There will still be a need for the military. There will still be people who rise up against that. But it will be a much more manageable problem if we properly implement the development and diplomacy legs of this stool in order to build a more secure, world. And I think that's what we need to do and where we need to go. And I think things are getting better. I am the co-chair of the Caucus for Effective Foreign Assistance with Andrew Crenshaw, and I look at the lessons we've learned and how we implement development policy over the course of the last 20, 25 years, and it's getting better. We are understanding that it's not really effective development to simply spend U.S. money to hire a bunch of U.S. contractors to go into a country and build a bunch of stuff that they then leave. That it's got to be bottom up. The Millennium Challenge Corporation, I think, was a really inspired idea. The notion of working with a country for them to develop their own development policy and implement it through their governance structure with our help, instead of a top-down approach, a bottom-up approach. And I think we've made some improvements in those areas and can continue to do so. And I think the other big development in the last 10 years in this area is the private sector. Again, the Gates Foundation is the largest element of this. I forget, it's like $35, $40 billion, some unbelievable amount of money. But you've seen a ton of other groups rise up to get involved in development policy. And I think they have taken an approach that has helped spur the government side of it to greater efficiency and effectiveness. There's a bill that was introduced last Congress that I co-sponsored. It's been introduced again this Congress to measure outcomes of foreign assistance. What's working, what's not, so we can begin to get a better idea of what we should fund and where we should direct our dollars if this is going to work properly. So you're moving in that correct direction. Now, I still think there are some improvements that need to be made. My biggest argument in U.S. development policy is that we need to elevate the importance of USAID and concentrate the money. Right now, there's something like 35 different pots of development money run by a whole bunch of different agencies. If Raj Shah wants to really impact development, he's got only a tiny little sliver of that money in order to do it. And I always hold out as the model the Department for International Development in Great Britain, DFID. What they've done is they've concentrated, first of all, they've risen it to a cabinet level department. It does not report to anybody. It is its own cabinet level. And they've concentrated the money so that if you are in charge of development policy, you are actually in charge of development policy. You control the money and where it goes and where the programs goes. And DFID is universally recognized as the most effective government development policy out there. I would like to see us move the U.S. more in that direction, to elevate the importance of USAID, to begin to consolidate some of those programs. Now, the problem with that, of course, is everybody has their own program. And in the U.S., we tend to like to basically protect our own program. And particularly in an era when the budgets are being cut and being challenged, there is that tendency to narrow one's focus to say, look, I care about education for women in Africa, so I'm going to make sure there's a line item for that program and that it's protected, and we have to spend a certain amount of money on that. But in doing that, you tie the hands of those in charge of development policy and make it more difficult for them to make the type of flexible decisions that are necessary. We have another example of this is we made an effort to reform the Food for Peace program. The Food for Peace program is an excellent program. It's a great idea. It's U.S. agriculture and then U.S. ships taking food to places in the world that need it. The problem is we have written into law the requirement that 85% of our food aid has to go through that program. And there are times when it makes more sense to simply buy the food closer to the source of the problem and get it to the people who need it then. It is a more costly, more expensive, and more time-consuming program to go through the Food for Peace program. You need a balance. So the State Department has proposed closing that gap to say that mandate 55% of it go to Food for Peace. Problem is, a lot of this money gets spent on U.S. interests, U.S. agriculture, U.S. maritime, and I can't blame them. I mean, it's an important program. I understand why they need it. But again, it's a block to our ability to have the flexibility to be as efficient as we need to do. But if I have one overarching goal as someone who serves on the Armed Services Committee and is also very interested in development, it is to bring defense, diplomacy, and development closer together, particularly defense and development. The military spends a lot of its own money on development programs. They do health care. In some cases, in Afghanistan and elsewhere, they've even built schools and drilled wells. We need to build a greater partnership there and make sure that people with the right expertise are doing the right jobs. And at the same time, the people on the development side need to understand how important security is. Yes, there are a lot of places in the world that when the U.S. military shows up, it can undermine the confidence of the local population. I get that. But if you don't have security as a starting point, you don't have development. You know, we've certainly seen that in Iraq and Afghanistan, where you've seen people, pull out development projects because it has not been safe. So you need definitely to work with the military to make sure you have a secure environment to do the good work that you need to do. That partnership needs to be strengthened. As I've said, I think there are steps being taken by people at DoD, people at USAID, and elsewhere to strengthen that partnership, but we need to look for every opportunity to make that as strong as possible in order to have the proper national security posture, in order to do the best we can to bring greater stability to the world. Because at the end of the day, I think if you had to sum up what the goal of U.S. foreign policy and U.S. defense policy is, it is stability and security. And then it is the steps to get there. And economic opportunity and diplomacy, all of that is critical to security and stability. We have the elements within the U.S. government to do that policy. We need to make sure they're working as well as they possibly can together. So thank you for the opportunity to at least outline those ideas, and I look forward to your questions, comments. As I always joke these days in Congress, answers are also welcome. So I'll look forward to the questions, and thank you.
So I would ask that those of you who have questions, maybe you could line up behind these mics. Questions, comments behind the mics. That'll make it easier on us as far as actually getting you heard on the television cameras. And Adam, I guess let me start.
Sure.
And this is not so much a question as an observation. The National Intelligence Committee's 2030 report estimates that by 2030, half the world's population will be middle class. But that means, of course, that the other half of the world's population is going to be mostly still quite poor. Are we heading in the right direction? What do you think the effect of this trend, which is more and more people climbing out of poverty and into the middle class, will have on questions like violence around the world?
Well, I think it certainly will improve the situation. As I've said, the more people have economic opportunity, the better off we are. But it is a stark reminder of how many are still left behind. And I think it is a great challenge to make sure you pull as many people up as possible. Look, we're not going to eliminate poverty. We're not going to eliminate people who struggle, but we can certainly reduce the numbers. And there have been number of places that have made progress in that area. You can see the difference.
And I guess if you had a broadly scattered middle class, so that the entire globe is essentially covered, then you've got individuals who are really invested in not having violence pop up, and so they can work with those individuals who are feeling disenfranchised, feeling as if they have no opportunity, lack freedoms, that sort of thing, in their communities, which lessens the task that we have globally trying to keep peace.
And that's a great way to put it, that they are invested in stability. And look, there are a number of people who are, as I've said, ideological, they're going to be violent, but most people, who get forced into that, when you read the stories about countries that have fallen apart like Lebanon when it did and elsewhere, it's like, these are people who, as I like to put it, just want to get through the day. They want to be able to feed their family, they want to be able to have a decent life, and if you give them that, they won't consider violence for a second. So that's the direction we need to go in.
Well, I'm just really pleased that the Congress has people in it today that are as thoughtful as Adam is about these kinds of issues that are critically important to the United States and to the world. And with that, why don't we start over here? Question, observation, answer, that would be even better.
Congressman, first of all, thanks for your leadership on foreign assistance. That means a whole lot to the community here in Washington. I'm Anthony Garrett from Internews, an international media development organization. And my question is, as the American troops draw down in the coming year in Afghanistan, what can be done to protect women, journalists, human rights activists, and the other good folks who have put their faith in the West and in the good work that's happened the last 10 years, so it's not in vain?
Yeah, it's very difficult, and that's what, I mean, what we are doing is we are working very, very hard and have been, particularly since 2009, to train the Afghan National Security Forces. And I spoke with General Dunford yesterday. You know, they are now in the lead in all military operations throughout Afghanistan, except for counterterrorism. And that they have significantly improved the quality of that security force. Now, yeah, I'm not going to kid you, there's going to continue to be challenges, and I think, you know, when you look at development, you know, particularly protecting women, you can look at a society, and the societies that educate women are far more prosperous and far more successful than those who don't. It is, I think, the ultimate measure of whether or not you're headed in the right direction. And that's part of the reason why countries like Afghanistan, even Pakistan, have struggled. You know, so we're going to rely heavily on the folks that we have trained. Hopefully, we will get a bilateral security agreement, so there will be some U.S. presence still there to help with that. But it's an enormous challenge. But the one thing I'll say about this, and this has come up in the context of Syria and elsewhere, we can't kid ourselves that the U.S. military can show up everywhere and protect everybody. That's why I say this broader three-legged stool approach with development, diplomacy, you know, we have got to get to the point where local populations are responsible for their own security. We simply cannot do it all, and we're not in a position to do it because, you know, nobody, as George W. Bush famously said, nobody likes to be occupied. And, you know, you see a U.S. military showing up, it's going to create a certain amount of hostility in countries around the world. Countries have to become responsible for their own security. We have to help them in the best way we can.
Thank you, Congressman.
Here at the Institute, we're convinced that the political transition is critically important, that the United States and all USG entities need to be focused on trying to help Afghanistan get the right kind of political transition. If the government falls apart because of turmoil as a result of a poor presidential election next year and then provincial elections the following year, if the government falls apart, it's going to be very difficult to keep the Afghan security forces together. They're well armed, they're well trained. We could see one heck of a civil war, and there would be a terrible retrogression where women's rights and all kinds of other progress that's been made are concerned. And so we really are very focused on the political transition and trying to get that right, trying to help Afghanistan get that right. Yes, sir?
And I'm Will Embry from DynCorp International, former Foreign Service officer. Just a quick follow-up on the last question is, we're disappointed to see that DOD is de-scoped the program supporting training women in the Afghan National Security Forces. Seems to me short-sighted. We've made some progress there, long way to go, and that's, I think, a bad thing. But there's been a debate in the administration, in aid, in the contractor community over the last 4 or 5 years on whether it's more effective to use development money for aid to hire contractors to do work in various places, or whether they should give that money to the local governments and to local NGOs. There are arguments on both sides.
Right.
Foreigners may cost more, but on the other hand, the locals may not be able to do it. And in most countries where we have aid programs, the corruption factor is pretty high. Where do you and Representative Crenshaw come down on this?
Well, I think we are more proponents of the local approach for a couple of reasons. Number one, we were so much on the other side of it for so long. One, development advocate, said, in response to the criticism, we've spent so much money on foreign aid, given this money away to other people, what have we got for it? And he says, well, we haven't really spent that much money on foreign aid in that sense. We basically, we've given the money to ourselves. We're paying our own contractors to go over and do that work. That's not really the same as giving it to them. We erred on that side for too long. That's number one. Number two, it's common sense. I mean, sustainability just doesn't happen if the local population, the same is true, in security. That's why we're training. I mean, you can come in and do everything for everybody, but you can't stay there forever. And when you're gone, what's left? And there are, terrible stories of, all these great projects being built. Then we leave, and 3 years later, it just sits there in disrepair. So I'll say that. I think I would err on that side, but it's going to be a balance too. I mean, because you have to have the people with the expertise to begin to train the local population. You can't just throw it at them if they don't know how to handle a given thing. So it's a balance between the two. But where we have erred in the past has been, I think, excessively on the side of doing it ourselves and not truly training. And that's whether you're talking about agriculture, rule of law, governance, healthcare, education, whatever it is. We really need to focus on that point when we're not going to be there anymore. Are the people that we're training and working with going to be capable of doing it? So that I would err on that side, but say there's always going to be a role, for experts to come in. I mean, I was in Kenya not long ago. They had folks from DuPont out there talking about agriculture, and they've made enormous progress based on some U.S. expertise in terms of building, more resilient crops. And this is without genetically modified. This is just interspecies doing it the way you're supposed to. So it's going to be a balance. But I think if we've erred on the side of too much of us, and some of that's money. Some of that is just, the groups want the money, obviously. I think we'd be better off training the local population, which is why the Millennium Challenge Corporation, I think, is such a good idea.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Congressman. My name's Howard Sumka. I spent most of my career with USAID. And if we had a couple hundred more like you in Congress, I think we could go a very long way in fixing things. I think there are a few sort of key issues in the development and sort of the big picture development problems. One is, you just sort of alluded to it, public understanding of how much we spend on foreign assistance and what we do with the money. These famous surveys where you ask people how much we spend on foreign aid, and they say about 10% of GDP, and
Right.
It turns out it's 0.7%, and they really think we should be spending 4 or 5. So there's a problem of getting that message out. The second issue is the politics, which you talked about in terms of the food aid programs. And I wonder if you see any way to get around those issues. I mean, I know the problems there, but one you didn't talk about much, but alluded to, is the whole question of accountability for our assistance programs. And I watched over a 25-year career where accountability became the end rather than a way to check on what we were doing. And the amount of resources that USAID puts into measuring things and the kinds of silly things we come up with to measure so that we can show results have sort of gotten a bit out of proportion. And I understand that we need to show impact, and I understand that we need to start from the bottom up, but even starting from the bottom up needs institution building.
Right.
And human development, human resources development in the countries we work with. And those are very, very hard to measure. It can take a decade to build the kinds of government institutions that will sustain the work that we've been doing on the ground. And so I wonder how you think Congress and the American public can ever deal with that kind of an issue.
Well, let me take I'll take the last part first, and then I'll talk about public opinion in a second. I completely agree with you, and I think I'm a very enthusiastic supporter of all the private folks who have gotten involved in development. But there is sort of one downside. There's a tendency to assume that everything can be measured. And when you come from the private sector, and this is as a public sector person, something I've always struggled with, they're always like, well, why can't they do it like the private sector? I mean, we measure efficiency, we know what's going on. And here's the problem. The private sector could not possibly be simpler. What is your mission? You're trying to make money. That's it, period, end of story. And either you're making money or you're not. And if you got 5 departments and 3 of them are making money and 2 of them aren't, well, then you better get rid or fix the 2 that aren't. It's very simple to measure. It's no problem. It is not the U.S. government's job to make money. If it was, we would charge you a hell of a lot more to drive on our roads, for instance. Okay? We charge you a hell of a lot more when your house caught on fire. There's a whole bunch of different things we would do, and why the private sector can't get that into their head. And I have seen private sector systems that you have all process. They spend all their time trying to come up with the perfect process. It's like, well, if we do it. And there is a human element to this, that it is art more than science. Okay? You may not be able to measure something, and the time it takes to try to figure out how to measure it can get in the way of it. So you've got to have that balance. I completely agree with that, and I think some of the private sector folks get out of balance. They imagine that there is some algorithm out there that is going to perfectly show whether or not $1 spent on food aid is worth as much as $1 spent on tuberculosis. Not really. There's a certain amount of art to it. As far as public opinion is concerned, I often wonder, actually there was an article, this was going on 20 years ago now, that Michael Kinsley wrote that was entitled, "Everyone's Entitled to an Opinion," right? And he said, no, they're not actually. If they literally don't know what they're talking about, I mean, you could ask me in a poll what the best way to fix a car engine is, all right? And my answer would be utterly and completely worthless because I don't have clue one what I'm talking about. And then you reprint the poll and people are like, well, 68% of the people think that you ought to do the other thing. Yeah, but they didn't know what they were talking about. This whole people don't know what they want to spend on foreign aid. I will say this, I've cited this Pew Research poll because my frustration, is that there's a clear consensus in this country that we need to balance the budget, but we need to do that while providing $2 of goods and services for every dollar in taxes that people have to pay. That's impossible, by the way, keeping up with the math there. But Pew Research did a poll, people very concerned about the deficit, and asked them, okay, what do you want to cut? And they listed basically the 20 areas where the federal government spends money. And they said, do you want to keep it the same? Do you want to increase it, or do you want to decrease it? And if you added up the number of people who said either keep it the same or increase it, the American public wants to cut literally nothing. And here's my note of even foreign aid. Foreign aid was at the absolute bottom. Everything else was like at least 2/3 of the people were don't cut. Foreign aid eked out a 49-48 victory to not cut it. But I think the broader argument that we need to make is why foreign aid is so important to our own domestic interests. I mean, look, we are 4% of the population, responsible for 20% of the world's consumption. Nobody on Earth has as much of a stake in global stability as we do. Increasingly, we are dependent upon exports for our businesses, even small businesses. I got a guy's business down in Tacoma. He's got like 5 people. 75% of his business is exports. He sells something that has to do with security gates, and most of it's going to Mexico. But the point is, keeping stability in other places, we benefit from that. I mean, forget the moral argument of the fact that there's nearly 3 billion people living on less than, $2 a day, while we have the lifestyle that we have, just in terms of our own interest. And that's I've given many speeches where it's just pure and simple, straightforward. Here's why foreign aid is important, and make that case. And I'm going to keep doing that. So that's all we can do to try to make that case.
Paul?
Congressman, I'm Paul Hughes from the U.S. Institute of Peace. Your focus on diplomacy, development, and defense is a very important perspective for this city to take into account. You're really touching on a whole of government kind of argument. And in 1996, under President Clinton, he issued a presidential decision directive, PDD 56, which mandated that there be interagency training to tackle these kinds of issues. Yet it fell apart because nobody was willing to fund it or support it. Do you think that it is time again for something like that to be crafted? And if so, who would be the lead on organizing that training?
Well, I'll say 2 things about that. First of all, in order for this to really happen, the best model is how they tried to get the services to work better together within the military. This was a goal of, I think, the Goldwater-Nichols, there's too much division. This, in part, came out of the Desert One disaster and a bunch of other things. And it has been, I believe, successful. Now, you will still have, Air Force and Army, and they'll still be, but compared to where it was, Jim, when you were in the military, they worked much, much better together. And the way they did it is they mandated as part of your promotion that if you're in the Army, you got to go spend a year at an Air Force base working with them. And so you built an understanding of the other culture, and you built relationships. So in order for what we're talking about here to work, you would need, military guys to go spend a year at the State Department folks to go spend a year in the military. And we've seen some of that within the intelligence community. The National Counterterrorism Center, I think, certainly they have their critics, but you go in there and you've got FBI and NSA and CIA and DIA guys all working side by side and they build relationships, and they work better together, and we miss less because of it. Now, the flaw in all this is what the State Department will tell you is we don't have enough personnel to do our jobs right now. We can't take one of our people and send her over to the Pentagon. We don't have the room for it. So that's an inhibitor to that. And if we're really going to get that type of interagency, that's what you have to do, is you have to have people from one agency work to another as part of their advancement up the chain. The other thing is it's very personality driven. General McChrystal, was the guy who sort of pulled together the counterterrorism effort. Right after 9/11, we came up with the notion that it takes a network to beat a network. And through sheer force of personality, he pulled together all the different elements of our, security and intelligence community, and got them working together, and they're doing a pretty darn good job. But a lot of that comes down to individuals as well. And it's one of my favorite quotes from Admiral Olson, a Tacoma native who used to head the Special Operations Command. I did a trip to Africa, and they were introducing the concept of the MLEs, which are military liaisons for SOCOM, to go in and begin to work with the State Department, because SOCOM's in 70 some odd different countries and very much involved, and they want to be there to help prevent violence. They refer to it as preparation of the environment. I always like that phrase. The point was to try to make sure that things don't happen. And I went to one country and it was working really well. And then I went to another, and I won't name them, and it's like the ambassador couldn't stand these MLEs. The MLEs didn't have a clue what their mission was. They were talking about doing stuff that was way out of their lane and causing all kinds of problems. And so I went to Admiral Olson and said, we got to fix this. What can we do about this? And he's a very dry, deadpan guy, and he just said, well, the problem is if you've seen one MLE, you've seen one MLE, which was to say that it comes down to individual personalities. Are they committed to working together? So you got to look for the right people, for the person who has that ability to not be just obsessively focused on getting credit for everything, but working with other people. So you can change the structure, but it really comes down to the individuals who are involved, who know how to engage cross-agency and to build that culture.
I guess I'd interject here and observe that we're about to have a Special Operations Command liaison here at the Institute of Peace.
Terrific.
And it's in part because we work globally. We're a small institute, but we work to stop fights. And the military, of all people, understand the value of being successful in stopping the necessity to fight. It's one reason why SOCOM has people scattered throughout the globe trying to help with development. Better that we help these folks help themselves than we have to step in at some point and help them undo the mess that's been created there in order to further our strategic interests. And it's absolutely true that we benefit economically, as Adam has said, from stability globally. But then there are other threats. The proliferation of deadly weapons and deadly viruses and things like that is really quite remarkable in the modern age. And so we have the economic benefits of stability, and then stability can also lessen the likelihood that we're going to have problems with these threats that we have that are circling the globe right now. Over here.
Joel Henning, as a former member of the Project on National Security Reform, a congressionally mandated commission, I'd like to follow up on that last question. We used to have a motto that it's good to have good leaders and good organizations. You don't have to choose between them. In that regard, it's been sort of frustrating to watch sort of the dissipation of a lot of energy that was behind interagency reform as we moved into the first term of the Obama administration. It's good to hear in Congress there's a lot of attention, it sounds like, to the matter and interest in this. I'd like to comment or ask specifically about the QDDR. Secretary Clinton, in her parting testimony, made a plea to institutionalize this in statute. It's incredibly difficult to get real interagency cooperation in an operational and strategic sort of way unless you have something you can really count on over a longer period of time in terms of developing capabilities and fielding those capabilities. Could you comment on where that is, what level of interest there is in that?
I'm not sure where that's going to go. I think that would be enormously helpful if we found some way to consistently analyze the whole of government approach. I don't know that the QDDR really was that. It was more the State Department's view on the world. And in fact, the QDDR, even as it was coming out, was kind of competing with the National Security Council effort to put out its own findings on where development was at. So I guess what I would say is I think that'd be great if we had something that was an interagency analysis, just like, you know, the QDR, you know, looks at all things military. If we had a QDDR, which looked at all things development, but you'd have to have more than just the State Department doing that. So if we could pull that together, that would make sense. As far as where it's at, I think it's stalled at the moment. But your question has prompted me to look into that a little bit more closely and see if we can't move that, because I think that would be very helpful.
For the benefit of the audience that isn't familiar with Washington lingo, QDDR means absolutely nothing to anybody out there, you know, like 99.9% of Americans.
Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review, which
Yeah,
is
and
modeled on the QDR.
And then here's
And there's
what you,
been one, I believe, yeah.
Sorry,
there's been one that was done.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
that's correct.
Yeah. And you kind of wonder whether maybe we could head in the direction of a QDDDR, Defense Development Diplomacy, Defense Diplomacy Development
Right.
Review on a quarterly basis. We're about to go through the QDR for the Defense Department. And it would be nice to maybe try and do all three at once and sort of blend the two, since we're talking about a whole government approach.
That would make sense.
Yes, sir.
Hi, Alex Dobian from the Center for International Policy. First of all, just want to thank you for your time and answering all of our questions here. So earlier when you were talking about building closer links between defense and development, I immediately thought back to AFRICOM, which when it was established was supposed to, is trying to be something different from the other combatant commands, incorporating more civilian people into the structure, having more development people and closer links to USAID. And so I was wondering if you thought that was an effective way to build closer ties between defense and development, or in a more broader sense, what would you say to the people who think that there's too much, mission creep at the Pentagon, and that the defense people should do defense, and that the development people should do development, and that, they should just sort of focus on what they're good at?
Yeah, I would say those people are wrong, because there's too much crossover between the two. Now, if you want to say that you need to be careful not to get out of your lane and to make sure that you pick the right people to do it, that's fine. But I think defense people have to know what's going on in development, and development people have to know what's going on in defense. And so, it depends on how you put the question, I guess. But if you're saying they should just divide, I don't agree with that, because there's too much crossover. And a lot of times, the reason the DoD gets involved in development is because they are in there first providing security. And they're the ones who are there, they're the ones who have the money. So if part of providing security is providing medical care to a local village, they do it. SOCOM guys are trained to do it. What I would say is that they need to view that as temporary, okay? Get the security in place if you've got to do short-term, but then get the development experts in. The other thing I'll say is I may be one of the few people who feels this way, but I think AFRICOM has done a pretty darn good job of exactly what it was set up to do. And the best example of that right now is the Horn of Africa. And there's another piece that I haven't mentioned yet. Part of the way that we take full advantage of a 3D approach to our national security is partnership capacity, is building the capacity of friendly nations to do a variety of different things that are in their interest and in our interest. And that's really what's happened in Somalia. I'm always struck by Somalia when people talk about how Afghanistan's a mess. We can't possibly reduce the troop levels below, 100,000, 68,000, whatever. We have to keep that amount there. In Afghanistan and Pakistan, there's significant challenges in that region, but I think most would agree that between Somalia and Yemen and that area, they at least kind of rival it in terms of chaotic violence. The official number is classified, but it's a triple-digit number of U.S. military personnel in that entire area that are doing a reasonably effective job of containing the violence in Yemen and Somalia from spreading out, versus the still, I think, gosh, we're close to 100,000 if you counting NATO and everything still in Afghanistan. Well, how did they do it? Well, they did it because they built the capacity of Ethiopia, of Kenya, of Uganda, of Burundi, to help us. It was their local population. I mean, they cared about Somalia being chaotic as well, so it wasn't like we were just sort of paying them to do our bidding. We had mutual interest. We built their local capacity, and they're doing most of the work. And by the way, it's vastly more effective if you have a local population do it than if you have a U.S. military officer. So I think that partnership, and at the same time, the military has trained those folks I just mentioned, but you've also had a ton of development projects in there in Kenya. I think that mix is working reasonably well there. Now, we have the great challenge of trying to figure out how to make it work in the Mali, Niger, Nigeria region. We also have not had as much success in the eastern DRC, where chaos continues to reign. But we've seen the model that we can use our elements to build that local capacity and mix defense and development effectively.
I was in Oslo a couple months ago participating in a Business for Peace Awards process, and part of this was a seminar where Chatham House rules, so you can't say who was there and who said what, but I gave some remarks arguing that internationally businesses need to be more actively involved in trying to pursue peace. And the response I had from one of the participants in this seminar was, well, we have to be careful about roles and missions. It's really our role and our mission to do that, and that's why business should not be doing it. So I couldn't agree more with Adam's initial comment. That's just dumb. I mean, clearly, you don't want whoever going out there trying to further peace in an incompetent way, but all of us have an interest in avoiding fights.
And the business, back to the Horn of Africa, part of what's helped Rwanda is there's a huge U.S. business interest involvement there. I mean, Costco, I forget some other people got involved and said, hey, how can we start to attract businesses to the region? We're trying to do the same thing in the eastern DRC. There are some small companies. There's a small company in Seattle, Theo Chocolate, that is beginning to source, some of their cocoa from the eastern DRC, as part of getting that business going. So yeah, all of those elements are just key to getting to the development place you need to be at.
We've been talking about maybe having a catchphrase here, and one of the things that somebody came up with was, we stop fights, join us. So, I mean, who wouldn't want to join people in trying to stop fights? It's kind of, everybody has an interest in this. Yes, ma'am?
Thank you very much, Congressman, for being here. I'd like to turn the conversation a little bit to how we can help other countries, friendly nations, promote this 3D strategy, particularly nations that may or may not be doing precisely what we would obviously like them to do. I work for a small NGO that does work on Bahrain, but that's just one nation of many that we have a very large defense interest in and a great relationship with, that is also not fulfilling their obligations for development of all citizens. And oftentimes people say, when I ask this question, they say, well, we have behind the scenes conversations, or we can pressure our friends in the government, but I think that there's more to be done, and I would be interested to hear what you think can be done, both in Congress and then also NGOs and then private sector. I'm actually a Seattle resident, so I'm a big fan of what the work they're doing, a lot of the NGOs there and private sector is doing. I think that there is a role for them in these countries, and I'm curious to hear your opinion.
That's a great question. One of the great challenges when we're looking for local partners in the way that I just described. There probably isn't a single local partner that we've had that there isn't some group of people that have said yes, but their government is awful. Certainly I've heard that about Ethiopia. There's considerable. I have a substantial Ethiopian population in my district. There are concerns about their government. Certainly, Bahrain is very well documented in terms of where they're at. And now we're wrestling with that very question in Egypt, of course. And it is a very, very difficult one to answer, and it has to go case by case. I do think that there has been a tendency for us to overreact and cut off our nose to spite our face by saying, this government isn't doing what we're like, we're out of here. Now, the most famous example of this, and I don't know what you do about it, because I certainly think that human rights, and in the case of Pakistan, the Pressler Amendment, most Americans don't know what the Pressler Amendment was. I think every single Pakistani knows exactly what the Pressler Amendment was. It cut off all aid to Pakistan because Pakistan was developing a nuclear weapon. Now, it was bad that they were developing a nuclear weapon, and certainly it has led to greater instability and all manner of problems. But it also meant that there was a lost decade in relations between Pakistan and the U.S. And while we've certainly had many reasons why the Pakistanis dislike us as much as they do, that's one of the biggest ones. Did that help us more than hurt us? I don't know. I mean, you've had this debate over the Leahy Amendment. I dared to suggest that maybe there were some tweaks that could be made in the Leahy Amendment, which, you know, made a lot of people upset. The Leahy Amendment basically says if you can't continue, our military cannot continue to train units if there is a proven human rights abuse by anyone in that unit. And I completely support the Leahy Amendment. I think we need to have that forcing mechanism. The question is how broad it has been applied. If there is a human rights abuse and then you have to pull completely out. Because the other argument is, and the argument that Admiral McCraven makes to me is, we need to be there to help fix this. And I think that's where a lot of people haven't caught up with our military is not what it was in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, okay? We have decided that human rights is an enormously important part of training security properly. When I mentioned the Philippines earlier and how we train their security forces, a big part of what we train their security forces to do is how to get the local population on your side. Spoiler alert, kicking indoors and shooting people is not the way to do it. So how do you build that? And that's what we train them to do. So if you have these human rights problems and then we pull out, does that make it better? Now, I'm not going to suggest that that means that no matter what we stay in, that we never draw the line. I just think it is a difficult balance to strike. Do things get better if we simply completely abandon the situation? Now, you know, that's why it's always easiest to not be the decision maker, to stand back on the outside and say, well, what you ought to do is you ought to maintain the relationship, but you ought to force them to do what you want them to do. Yes, that's what we'd like to do. I think of parenting, actually, as I think of this. But, you know, it's a delicate balance that we always have to strike. And I'm never going to be one of those who's, you know, self-righteously saying, you know, how dare we do business with these people? You know, they're awful, blah. It's like, yeah, but how much better would they be if we weren't doing business? And what are we accomplishing? I think you got to balance all that out. And as you can tell from my answer, I haven't fully figured out how to balance that out yet. It's something I'm continuing to learn about.
When I was in Congress, I'd get letters from people that wanted to close the School of the Americas. And that was at Fort Benning, and you might remember all kinds of problems with some of the officers and acts that they committed in South America, you know, after they'd been trained in the United States. And so the assertion was that somehow they were better at brutality and human rights violations because they were trained by us, and so consequently the School of the Americas should be closed. Lots of protests, etc. Many people here are familiar with that. I'd respond, and so the name was changed from the School of the Americas to the School of the Western Hemisphere. So part of the response is, well, perhaps to add cover, the name has been changed to the School of the Western Hemisphere. And what I would say is, yeah, I do think we should close the School of the Western Hemisphere. We should have a School of the World. In other words, we should continue to do this. We've got to have these relationships. We've got to build this kind of capacity. But yeah, we at the same time need to train and teach and educate those who come through our schools that the best course is one that respects human rights. It's better for the individuals who have the power. It's certainly better for the individuals who don't have the power.
And if we get it, we also need to be mindful that we have not had the best record in the past on this. Okay, I mean, we have, in fact, you know, when you go back to some of the people that we were doing business with in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and we have to sort of communicate to the world that we got it, and we have changed the way we're approaching this.
Yes, sir?
Good morning, Congressman. My name's Jonathan Ng. I work at Department of the Army, and prior to that, I was at U.S. Africa Command. So I just have one observation, since there's a lot of references to that, and then two questions. The observation is that at U.S. Africa Command, when I was there up until about April of 2012, they had about a staff of approximately 2,000 individuals, and that, you know, they also had components and whatnot for the Marines, Special Operations, Army, etc. Of that 2,000 person staff, we only had approximately 21 individuals from the interagency community, and that was the Department of State, USAID, as well as, you know, Department of Justice and whatnot. When I was there, of those 21 some people, there's only one individual from USAID, and she was extremely valuable in our staff planning processes, execution, whatnot. But only having one person, it was very difficult for her to get around to all the various commands, subcommands, working groups, and whatnot. So I'm definitely a proponent of having more interagency cooperation through embedding staff members throughout. My first question is, over the last decade or so with Iraq and Afghanistan, the Department of Defense has either expanded and or developed capabilities for development, specifically civil affairs, the provincial reconstruction teams in Afghanistan, for example. Is it your opinion that Department of Defense should retain those capabilities, or should those capabilities somewhat migrate along with the resources to USAID?
It's my opinion that they should retain most of those capabilities, but that they should do so in close cooperation with USAID, so that it is not the permanent responsibility of DoD to do that. I mean, the reason DoD started doing this stuff is they were the only ones there, they were the only ones that had the money, they were the only ones in position to do it, and they sort of figured out as they went. And that's going to happen. I mean, you're going to go into an area that is not secure, and the military secures it, and it's not a seamless transition to say, okay, it's all good, now let's fly in the development guys. You're going to need a transition period, and I think also it improves the cooperation between the two. Now, it's really tough because the DoD guys have got to have greater respect for the development and the other people, which, as you know, in Iraq and Afghanistan didn't always happen. It was like, hey, we're doing this, get out of here. And I think that's changed a lot in the last decade, that your average DoD person has developed a great deal more respect for what development and diplomacy people do, but that's going to be the key element. But I wouldn't say that that's something that DoD should stop doing. I think it's just too integral to a long-term mission.
If I could interrupt, you said that was your first question.
Yes, sir.
We don't really have time for more than one more question.
Okay, actually, I'll do you can fire off the second one quick, and then
real quickly, because we really do need to close this in probably about a minute.
Yeah, go ahead.
Second question, sir. What's your view about DoD's expanded funding authorities for conducting foreign security assistance to build partnership capacity of foreign security forces?
I think it's great. I think it's an enormously helpful thing for us.
Good answer. Yes, sir. Real quickly. Very quick question.
Sir, what's it going to take to restart the peace talks with the Taliban, and announcing the zero option? Does that make us lose leverage when, even at the height of the surge, we never were able to clear Taliban strongholds like Wardak and Logar in the southwest, and then now Kunar and Nuristan have complete al-Qaeda strongholds, as you know?
Well, it was really more the media that announced the zero option than it was us. There isn't really a zero option. In fact, it's not the same situation as it is in Iraq. Even if we don't get a bilateral security agreement, we still have the ability to stay in some numbers. That's complicated, and my staff knows better the answer to that, but that is true. So I don't think that's going to happen. As far as restarting, it all comes down to the election. Do we have a reasonable transition to from Karzai to what comes next? And that's fingers crossed. But I think really you need to get through that election, show what the next government's going to be, and then I think you will have a better chance of restarting those governments. And that has to happen. I mean, we have to have negotiations with some elements of the Taliban. Yes.
Well,
I thank the Institute of Peace for inviting you and your inspiring speech. Now, the only question I have, I'll come to it very quickly, is doesn't the foreign aid encourage dependability on foreign aid?
It depends on how you do it. If the foreign aid is helping you build a better healthcare system so that your doctors and nurses can then run a hospital that's actually operating, no, it doesn't build dependency. If you're drilling wells and building schools that then local people are working in and maintaining, no. I mean, that is exactly why we need to shift from simply coming in and saying, well, get out of the way, I'm going to do it, to working cooperatively with the local population, saying, you're going to do it, but if we have a little bit of money to build something that can help you do it, then we're headed in a better direction. That's the way we have to do it.
Thank you.
I think we have a big round of applause for a very thoughtful member of Congress.